So the goal of this session that I was given, I've amended it slightly to suit myself, I'm afraid, is to learn how to apply biblical revelation to contemporary socio-political problems. What is the agenda for public life is how I've kind of subtitled it for myself. What is the agenda for public life? So I'm going to dive right in at the deep end here based on what we dealt with in the previous session. Yep. Everyone's got a copy, I hope, of this outline. And I asked the question, what is relational thinking? Now, I could have spent a lot of time building up to this. I'm going to do it the other way around. I'm going to put it straight on the table, and then I'm going to kind of explain it, defend it, expand it. So we decided a long time back. You looking for want a copy?
There was an extra one.
There's a spare
Go
one.
ahead, just take that one. Oh, there's a spare one there.
In the Jubilee Centre team, we decided a long time back that if we were going to take the biblical model into public life in a way that would gain support not just from the Christian community but also from the wider community in our country, then, and internationally as it turned out, that we needed to find some way to articulate this as a system in a way that would interest people, challenge people, and be with people where they were, rather than starting to talk about a Christian system or something like that, and I'll unpack that in a minute. And we decided on the term eventually not to use the term relationism, because you could say, well, this is another ism, it's like fascism or Marxism or something, and we could have called it relationism, but we decided relational thinking was slightly more open-ended, more inclusive, kind of invited people in to think about this for themselves. Now, there are a lot of people talking about the idea of relationships now in what's broadly termed behavioral economics or the behavioral sciences. So why do people make decisions as they do? How do you influence those decisions? It's through relationships. What are you trying to achieve? Well, you want good customer relationships, so you talk about customer relationship management. That's all in the area of relationships. And people are slowly beginning to wake up to the fact that schools and education depend on relationships between teachers and pupils, and good hospitals depend on how the doctor conducts himself, or the clinician with the patient, or what happens in supply chains is actually a set of relationships. I mean, people are really waking up to the fact that relational capital or relationships, however you describe it, are all important. So don't think of us here as having a monopoly on the term relationships. I mean, but in society now it's becoming a more and more prevalent discussion. I think we got in on it quite early. We were talking about this in the mid-90s before it really entered the UK. It was already, though, becoming prominent in the US by then. But we wanted to capture this term relational, and so we started calling everything relational this, relational that, relational schools, relational companies, relational finance, relational hospitals, relational whatever. So we then coined the term relational thinking. Now, we could have written it with a small r, relational, and a small t, thinking, which would have been sort of descriptive of what's going on out there. But because we were wanting to say we're coming out of a certain starting point, so we're saying that certain relationships are good, certain relationships are not good. So we don't actually agree with the caste system, which is a set of relationships. We don't agree with the mafia, which again is a very strong set of relationships, or with your Chinese gangs, for that matter. I mean, there are all sorts of relationships that are toxic. There's abusive relationships. Well, it's still a relationship, but it's toxic. It's negative. It's horrible. So relational thinking is kind of saying, look, we believe not just in the idea of relationships, but certain kinds of relationships, and we spell out what those relationships are. They're based on, please, next slide. They're based on the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, why the Judeo-Christian tradition? Why don't we just say based on the Bible, based on Christianity? There are several reasons for that. One is we want to go into secular organisations in Britain. If we go into a school or a company and we say we are coming as a Christian organisation, they will generally say, sorry, no, if you're Buddhist, that's fine, but if you're Christian, no. Or if you're secular, that's fine. That's also a belief system. But if you're Christians, no, we don't want you, because they're afraid that you're just doing evangelism. By calling it Judeo-Christian, we are partly talking about the fact that we are Old Testament as well as New Testament. That comes to your point. And we're also trying to build relationships with the Jewish community. But we're saying, notice it says to the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we're saying, well, what does that mean? Well, it goes back to all the creeds of the churches through the generations of the church. So it's not what are theologians saying today about something. It's saying what has been the traditional view of the church on these areas of thinking. Now, anything can be disputed, of course. We are talking about interest being relationally unhealthy. That goes back in the Christian church right to the beginning until Calvin comes along in 1550 and wants some more money in Geneva to create jobs, so he starts bending the rules on interest. Of course, not too much and this and that, but it was Calvin actually who caused the chaos. And the Roman Catholics then allow interest formally in about 1854. But you can see the church gradually swings over to accept interest. But for 1500 years, they've said no, for a whole variety of reasons. We articulate it slightly differently, but a lot of the ideas are in common with the reasons that they were there before. Notice that this definition of relational thinking is not just for public life, but for private life. Yeah?
Sorry, is there anything more on that Calvin problem and what you're talking about, how he subjects those rules on interest?
Yeah, we have a lot on that.
Okay.
So there's a paper on the Jubilee Centre website which is called Interest in Interest.
Okay.
And it traces the history of the story on interest in the church from the time of Jesus to today.
Thanks, I didn't want to...
No, it's a really interesting
I'll send you a link
issue.
to it, Dave.
Thanks, mate.
And I would really like just to explain why interest is wrong. So I will divert briefly onto that relationally. I think Jesus gives the answer to it in the parable of the talents. In the parable of the talents, Jesus says interest is fine because, you shouldn't have buried my money in the ground, you should have put it in the bank and I would have got it back with interest. That's what Christians think. Actually, he doesn't say that at all. Go back to the story, read it carefully. What Jesus actually says to the man who buried his talent in the ground, he says, so you knew, did you, that I'm a hard man. Hard, uncaring, uncompassionate, unengaged in society. I'm a hard man who reaps where he doesn't sow. That's very contrary to biblical thinking. To reap where you haven't sown, that's taking the profit without doing the work.
Yeah.
If that's the kind of man I am, what you should have done with my money is put it in the bank and I would have got it back with interest. That's both in Matthew and Luke, i.e. putting money in the bank and getting it back with interest is taking a return where you haven't done any work, where you haven't engaged with the people using the money. You've just taken the profit without getting engaged at all with how the money is used. That's like putting your money into a pension fund, having no idea what's done with the money, and then you just take
I've read that paper.
the profit.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
But not everyone has.
But not the interest on it, yeah.
And it also raises questions about stock markets, actually, because aren't people just putting money into a stock market without knowing what really is being done with the money? They're just really taking a bet. And that is reaping where you haven't sown. Anyway, there's a lot we could discuss there, but I get to skip on. Sorry. But I might come back to it. So relational thinking is based on the relational values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's how we describe it, so that we are kind of rooting ourselves somewhere in terms of what constitutes good and right relationships, and thereby, incidentally, what are wrong relationships. So it allows us to say, well, we do support marriage because that's part of our tradition. And it says, informed by Mosaic institutions. Now, I've put that in brackets because it isn't generally what we go out to the public with, because they wouldn't understand what are Mosaic institutions. But actually we believe that if you want the kinds of relationships that are there in the Trinity, then biblical law has a lot of clues to tell you what they look like and how to do it. And those are not just values, which are slightly abstract. You know, you should have compassionate relationships, kind relationships, fair relationships, etc. But also what kind of institutions are going to lead to those relationships. So the absence of debt is to make sure you avoid the injustices and lack of fairness between creditors and borrowers. So it doesn't say no borrowing, it just says you must wipe off all debts every 7 years. Well, imagine we put that into the credit card agreements today. Every 7th year, all credit card debt is cancelled. The banks would be a little bit more careful about who they lent to, especially if there was no interest. But these institutions, like the importance of extended families, are very important to individual well-being. And how do you create extended families? Comes back to a question I was asked by somebody sitting there, I think, earlier. How do you get strong families then? How on earth do you produce them? Well, I think money is a big factor. What we've done is we've stripped all financial affairs out of families and given them generally to other institutions, governments, banks, others. So welfare now is not seen primarily as something going on within extended families. It's something which you get as an individual from the government as a right. And that changes all kinds of things when you start taking money out of it, because money is a form of social glue. It's what holds people together, incentivizes people to connect to each other. So relational thinking is more than just a lens. It's more than just saying, let's look at this issue from a relationships point of view rather than a financial point of view or an environmental point of view. It's more than that. It's saying, well, yes, there are a number of values that we're pursuing here and a number of institutions that are likely to promote those values. I'm moving on, please. Why don't we have an explicitly Christian agenda? Well, I refer to Christophobia in many countries. It's a bit like homophobia. It's an irrational fear that people have of Christians. Christianity is not a political faith. I don't think we spread Christianity by creating a Christian government in the way that Muslims believe you spread Islam by simply creating an Islamic government. And I think the danger of Christian political parties, like the Christian Democrats in Europe, is that people get confused about whether what Christian Democrats do is what real Christianity is. I remember talking to a Belgian on the way back from when we were doing work in Rwanda after the genocide. And he said to me, what puts me off Christianity is looking at the Christian Democrats. They're fighting each other, they're backstabbing. And of course, most of these Christian Democrat MPs are not Christians at all. They're just using the label in order to get political power. And the trouble is the danger is you mix Christianity with politics in a way that then confuses their understanding of the Christian faith, which is a point that I've made to Johannes de Jong from time to time. Now, I can see the other side of the argument. It shows where you're coming from, it shows your philosophy and your roots, so many Christians feel that that's fine. I feel less comfortable about it. But again, it depends on how it's portrayed, how it's advanced. And I think the other important point is that Christians should agree about points of principle, but can legitimately disagree on points of policy. We all agree, perhaps, that we want to keep Sunday a special day and not have people working. But there are different ways to achieve that. You can, for example, make it illegal to employ somebody on a Sunday. Or you can make it illegal to open certain kinds of shops or businesses on a Sunday. Or you can require that people are paid 3 times as much for working on a Sunday. So although lots of people would like to work on a Sunday, the employers don't want to employ them because it's too expensive. So lots of different ways to do it. And Christians can legitimately disagree about the policy, which is the means, even if they agree on the end, which is the principle. So it's very important to keep separate the means and the ends, the principle and the policy. I'm moving on, please. On to the next. Christianity is a relational religion. Now, I'm going to race through this. But it's so important to get hold of this relational idea. I just wanted to kind of drive it home to you for a few minutes before I move on. So we believe in a relational God. The Trinity are three people in perfect relationship from before time. So before the physical world is made, God is there. And God is in relationship. So relationships precede the physical creation. That is incredibly important if you stop and think about it, because it also implies that beyond the physical creation there will also be relationships. And also it is what makes Christianity unique among world religions. Does a Muslim have a relationship with Allah? Well, I think they would regard that as blasphemous to say that they had a close relationship with Allah. No, he is distant, he is beyond, he is great, but he's not a friend. Or if you take Hinduism or Buddhism, the end goal is nirvana, where you are absorbed into the great nothingness and there are no more relationships. Relationships have gone. So the goal of existence is to get rid of relationships. And you have relationships on earth as a means of pursuing your karma, your journey, towards getting rid of relationships. Now, it doesn't mean that Buddhists and Hindus are not good parents or good children, but there's a kind of pointlessness about it because they're going to be extinct. And I remember my daughter going to a funeral of a Buddhist up in northern Japan, and she said it was devastating because the mother of this man who'd been killed in this car crash was completely inconsolable because she thought she would never ever see this guy again. The relationship was over, total, finished, because you're heading towards nothingness. It's difficult for us who believe in a future, in a hope, in a community, in heaven, to get our heads around that. But it's part of the good news that we proclaim that no, there is the chance of relationships. Now, obviously, the great relationship will be with Christ, but you know, Christ is talking to Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. He's not standing there in silence. They're having a conversation. So it's a relational story. Let's stop talking about the fall, which is a very individualistic idea of what happened in the Garden of Eden. Let's talk about the rupture. That's not an original idea. That Jacques Ellul, the French theologian, talks about Eden as a rupture of relationship between God and humanity, and in the most fundamental human relationship between men and women. Covenant is a relational term. The incarnation. Sorry, we should be on the next slide here. Got to keep awake, Philip. Keep moving. And the cross, which is the center of history for Christians, is not a political event, not a military event, or a financial event. It's a relational event. I've just been looking at, what's his name? Marr. Andrew Marr is a British commentator, political commentator, and he's written a history of the world. And it's basically about a series of battles and political dynasties and stuff like that. And you just realize how differently Christians think about the world. Actually, history is not primarily about these empires that come and go and stuff. It's actually centered on this relational event of how God sorts out the problem of how he can forgive us. Eternal life is about a community, a relational person. Jesus is the supreme relational person, and he defines everything from a relational point of view. Faith is about a relationship with him. That's what faith is. It's not an abstract term. It's a way of describing relationship and trust. He spends a great deal of time in prayer. Before he chooses his disciples, it's a whole night in prayer because those are going to be his closest relationships. He is constantly in touch with the Father. John's Gospel describes how all the time he's communicating with the Father, all the time. And take an idea like poverty. So we think of poverty as a financial condition. Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. And we think, oh, these people haven't got any money, they're all going to now hear the gospel. Well, that actually isn't what Jesus is talking about, because, in Luke's gospel, where this comes, in Luke 5, he's out with the tax collectors and sinners, but the tax collectors are not poor. He's with Zacchaeus on his way to the cross. The one person he stops to talk to, apart from a couple of blind people, in Jericho, is Zacchaeus, who's an extremely wealthy man. But relationally, he is poor. So Jesus is dealing with lepers and prostitutes and all kinds of people who are relationally poor. So does Tear Fund and World Vision and our other big Christian charities, do they concentrate on the financially poor or the relationally poor? If it's the relationally poor, why are they only working in India and Africa? Why aren't they working in America and Britain in our old people's homes? There's more relational poverty in Britain and America than there is in India and Africa. I mean, it really is life-changing if you start to see poverty as a relational condition and not primarily as a financial condition. And it also, incidentally, perhaps undermines Western arrogance a bit. We look down on these poor people in Africa. They're poor. They need to get developed like us, and we think of ourselves as developed countries. But actually, we are the underdeveloped countries, I think, in God's eyes, because our relationships are much more torn up than theirs. Look at our divorce rates. We've got 3.7 million children in our court system in this country. Look at our levels of child abuse. 1 in 5 children in this country has been referred to social services. Great. Is that what development is? Let's get rid of some of this arrogance that comes out of this financial mindset. And the church is a relational community. I'm not going to go into all those relationships, and please move on. A relational social... sorry. This is a Monet picture, which I love. It's sort of, what's the perfect relational society look like? Well, sort of Monet has a go. It's a bit kind of middle class in Paris. But I mean, it's a party, isn't it? I mean, it's about shalom, it's about peace, it's about harmony. Harmony is a really important word. I think harmony, in a sense, is a much bigger word than fairness or justice, a much more embracing kind of word. And I think the biblical concept is shalom. Jeremiah 29:7, where Jeremiah 29:7, the exiles in Babylon are told not to seek the justice of the city. They're told to seek the shalom of the city. Now, shalom involves justice, but it's bigger than that. It's about community. It's about love. It's about sharing. It's about people caring for each other. I wonder whether actually our new Prime Minister, when she was talking about one nation, was actually talking about the concept of shalom across British society. Now, I'm not saying I'm a huge advocate of her. I'm simply saying, is that what actually she's thinking about? The next slide you've seen already, and we'll move on from there. So I'm saying relational thinking is a different way of seeing the world. So I expect you all have microwaves. This is an illustration I've used many times if you've heard me speak before. But we think about a microwave in terms of finance, what it costs to buy it or run it. We think about it environmentally. Is it an efficient way of cooking food? But do we think about it relationally? So if I buy a microwave, how does it affect relationships in my home? 25% of homes in Britain no longer have a table at which you can eat together. Why? Because people come in, they put their food in the microwave, and then they go in their room, they go to the television, they go somewhere to eat it. They don't sit round and have a conversation anymore. Conversations have kind of gone. How do you think about a police car? Do you think about it again financially? What's it cost to run it? Do you think about it in terms of environment? Or do you think about, well, if you've got the police in the car, how do they connect and build relationships with the public? Now, it may be a very efficient way of keeping order, but how do then people think about the police from a long-term basis? What kind of relationship are you building? Now, I'm not saying the answer is abolish police cars. I'm simply saying think about relationally what's going on here in the way that you design the operations of your police force. I'm moving on. So I want to go through 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to go back one. Right. So when we wrote a book back in 1993, which got reviewed by The Economist to put out our ideas. It was called The R Factor. In The R Factor, writing it with David Lee, we came across a problem. And the problem was this, and it was David who said it to me, because he was trying to articulate our argument. And he said, my problem is I've got no language. You're talking about public policy here, but what's the language to discuss relationships? I don't have any language. So, what is a good relationship? How would you describe it? So do you want to use the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, and so on? But that doesn't seem to apply well if you're talking about a company's relationship with its supplier or its customer. Is it meant to show love, joy, peace? I mean, just not the right language. So in the end, we came to the idea of these 5 things here. We thought about the Jubilee, the ban on interest, all these institutions. Jesus says you have to understand these through the lens of relationship. So what is the Jubilee doing to relationship? And we said, well, it's providing continuity in people's relationships over a long period of time because they're rooted in the same community. Or it provides, we called it multiplexity, a breadth of knowledge of the other party. You know them not just because you go to their homes, but because you may meet them playing a game or doing a community event or providing welfare in the fields or working with them. So you know them in many contexts. So the issue of power comes up over and over again. It's really important. The idea not of equality, but of some idea of parity, equal worth, which gets reflected to some extent in, for example, pay differentials. Can you really say that the shop assistant feels equal worth with somebody paid 500 times that amount, who's the chief executive of the business? Shared purpose or goals, we call it commonality. Having the same goals and purpose bonds people together, and of course communication, and particularly whether you meet people face to face, where you get the body language, the facial expression, all kinds of things, of the tone of voice. They all help to fill out the quality of the communication. So if you now go back one.
Yep.
You go to this one, and we realized that you're talking here about communication, time or story, information, power, and purpose. All relationships operate in those 5 zones: communication, time, information, power, and purpose. Now, if you go back another one, then we realized, that's what I was just saying.
One more.
Then we realized, this is actually how it operated, that we kind of went back in our logic from these 5 terms we started with, which were about directness, continuity, multiplexity, parity, and commonality. We then went back to the 5 that we had in a moment ago, and then we went back again and we said, well, all of these are describing what you might call as relational distance. If you think of a relationship like a big cloud, how on earth do you describe a cloud? Well, it's difficult to describe the edges because they're a bit fuzzy. You might try and describe the density, but it's not very clear what it is. I mean, it's very difficult to describe a cloud. Now try and describe a relationship. What is the key idea that lies at the heart of a relationship? Well, a relationship is so huge, so complex. Even take a half an hour discussion and describe everything that goes on in half an hour in a relationship or in a conversation, and you could be writing for days if you include every word, analysis of every word, its history, its context, why they choose that word, not that word, what about the tone of voice, what were they thinking, saying, feeling, how does it tie in with throwing their arms around, whatever it may be. So we realize the Bible actually uses the idea of relational distance a lot. How near or far are you from God? Psalm 138 says, God is far from the proud and close to the humble. Your sins have separated between you and your God. I think that's Isaiah 59 too. I mean, over and over again, the Bible uses the idea of distance and proximity. So that's the key idea about relationships that we've built our kind of basis of thinking around, and what drives closeness and what drives distance. And that's an incredibly important issue for public policy, because all kinds of things that government does unintentionally drive distance rather than proximity. So move on. So now you can buzz right through those. Now there's an agenda here. And I realize I'm getting close to being out of time, which is a pity because the agenda is rather important. But hey, we'll make a start on it anyway. So I think the main thing to get here is that there is a personal agenda, an organizational agenda, and a national reform agenda. And then you have to say, well, which of these agendas are we really wanting to pursue and why? And you could choose any of them if you're interested in social reform. Personal finance is about debt. So you could be running a campaign around consumer credit and debt. Look at mortgage finance. It's actually a debt. If the price of your house goes down, you may be in debt for the rest of your life. You buy a house for £250,000 in Cambridge. Unfortunately, the price of houses goes down after you buy it by, say, 20%. And you didn't have 20% to put down for the house, you only had 5%. So now 15% of the value of the house is now your debt. And you will pay that bank off for the rest of your life, probably, because they're charging you interest every month. You've got no money to pay off that difference. Mortgages, there are alternatives to mortgages. There is a shared equity model where you own a percentage of the house and the bank owns a percentage of the house, and every year you buy a little bit more.
I just say that is...
People see the better results in the schools. It feeds up to policy, but it also feeds down into the families. So we're thinking, relational school, you can run a course on relational thinking on a Saturday morning for the parents. We've had discussions on that, not just in Britain, but in Singapore, for example. So you can take it up and you can take it down. So coming in at an organizational level is another way of changing the playing field, because in the end, the politicians want to see practical examples which work. And I have to say, the schools side, the set of metrics we've created for measuring these things have been incredibly powerful and successful at a school's level. They're really showing up amazing things that are going on in schools, and they deal with how to incentivize children to learn, how you stop bullying, all kinds of things. And also you can have relational hospitals, because the best way to get a hospital to deliver good health care is to think about the relationships between the clinicians and the patients, the clinicians and the nurses, between the different specialties, between the clinicians and the management, between the management and the nurses. I mean, a hospital, you can think of it as a matrix of relationships, as you can a school or a company, and then say, well, how do you influence people in each box of the matrix?
Michael, you've got another 10 minutes.
I need to stop. And it's a national reform strategy as well. So trying to change national objectives from a focus on GDP or human development goals that tend to be defined very individualistically, to how do you achieve shalom, mutuality, relationality, one nation, different languages you can use for that, reforming organizations and changing lifestyle. I'll move on. So you can think about relational thinking operating at all of those levels. all of those 4 levels, and one at the bottom as well, which is the personal lifestyle. And I'm going to skip over the next one on the key issues, unfortunately, though we can come back to that if anyone wants to. I'm going to just finish with this Copernican revolution. So Copernicus was a Polish scientist who came up with an outrageous idea in 1536 in a book. He said, actually, we all think the Earth is the center of the universe. And we think that the sun goes around the Earth because you see it in the morning, it starts in the east, goes down in the evening in the west. So you can watch it. So obviously we're at the center, the Earth goes around us. He said, no, actually, guys, that's wrong. Actually, it's the other way round. We go round the sun, and I can prove that to you because if we trace the planets, blah, 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 you can prove it. And for 100 years, people said he was mad, and then eventually the idea got to be accepted. Now, we're in the same space, I think. I believe in this room today. We're saying, as Christians, actually, the heart of the universe, that sun there, is relationships. And these planets, our various financial arrangements, are meant to serve the interests of these relationships. Whereas at the moment, we've got it completely wrong. We put money at the center, and we make our relationships serve the interests of the money. So we move people quite cheerfully in order that we can have higher productivity of labor, higher GDP, blah, 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 but the family relationships just kind of get lost. Now, changing the economic system to bring about that shift is a real challenge, to say the least. So I'm finishing on the next one. There's a whole series of, before you get to that, there's a sort of global movement that has kind of started around all of those websites, which are on your piece of paper, and then the Relational Thinking Network, which is a group of organizations, but you can join it individually as a partner if you want to. But the objectives are there, which are on your paper, of that movement, of the Relational Thinking Network. It's a network of people who are trying to pursue this vision. It's not a huge network, but it's kind of there and growing slowly. Are those 8 points which bear back on what I said in the last session and also to some extent in this session.
Thank you very much, Michael.